Welcome to this talk entitled, What's Wrong with the Left? Subtitled, And How to Fix It. My starting point is that the UK left is not in a good shape. It's in a better shape than it's been for a long time, and that's great, but Labour today should be 20 or 30 points ahead in the polls, not level pegging with the Tories. In the recent local elections, Labour sadly, and I emphasise sadly and regretfully, failed to make many of the predicted gains that it had hoped for. So my question is, how can we turn around Labour's fortunes and the fortunes of the left and wider progressive movement? How can we ensure that we move forward in a way that makes the left stronger, more effective, accessible, and popular? Now, hand on heart, I have to say I don't have all the answers. I've got no magic wand, no panacea. But what I want to do is share with you today some ideas which you may or may not agree with, and you might have better ideas, and I hope you'll put them forward during the Q&A. So I've got several ideas I want to talk about. The first is, for the left to be successful, it needs to be constructive, positive, and optimistic. I'm sad to say that so often the left is negative and oppositionist. The left is against the Tories, against NHS privatisation, against Trident nuclear missiles, against austerity, against corporate power and abuses. And quite rightly. But what is the left for? I think often, not always, but often the left is very weak on what its alternatives are going to be. And when we want to win public support, the public want to know, well, if you don't agree with this, what are you going to do instead? So, knowing exactly what a left government would do is a very important part of the equation of winning public support. I was at a debate yesterday on universal basic income, and one of the speakers, the main advocate, was Guy Standing, who I admire greatly and totally support his arguments in favour of a universal basic income. But I pressed him, not once but 3 times, what will be the level of this universal basic income, how much per week per adult, and how much will it cost for the whole of the nation, and how will it be funded? And he wouldn't answer. Now, I respect his decision not to answer, but I thought, how can you convince the public if you can't tell us what level the universal basic income will be set at, how much it will cost the government, and how it's going to be paid for? People want to know those answers, and to be a credible alternative, you've got to have those answers. When it comes to austerity, quite rightly, the left has been highly critical and oppositionist to austerity. But I have very rarely ever seen any left person explain how a left government would overcome the deficit and fund the public services we vitally need. You know, simply opposing austerity is not good enough. The public want to know, how are you going to plug the deficit? How are you going to fund these services? And I won't go into it now, but I worked out a clear funding package totaling £1,000 billion, by which we could not only plug the deficit and ensure it didn't recur, but also pay off a large proportion of the national debt. And when I've spoken about this to audiences, even very skeptical audiences, perhaps not everyone's totally agreed, but at least they've said, you're the first person I've ever heard spell out how we can get out of this mess and avoid the nightmare of austerity. The second point I'd make is that the left needs to embrace progressive collaboration. Unite the many to defeat the few. Isolate the main enemy, the Tories. Build a grand alliance against the Conservatives from the centre to the left, embracing Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, Plaid Cymru, the SNP, and perhaps even the SDLP and Sinn Féin. For the sake of winning, we have to sometimes be prepared to sink our differences, to work with others who we may not entirely or much agree with. But for the sake of the bigger cause, we have to be prepared to work with others. There is a mentality on a lot of the left that we are the only progressives, that all these other people, they're wrong. We're the ones who are right, and they have to follow us. That is arrogant and sectarian. Now, part of the answer in terms of building this progressive alliance is, of course, to embrace proportional representation, which Labour, still at the moment, will not support. In 2005, to give an example, the last time Labour won an election, Labour got 35% of the votes, but won 55% of the seats. That is not democracy. That is not what the Chartists and suffragettes fought for. In the 2015 election, the Conservatives won 37% of the vote, but 51% of the seats. Again, a clear disjunction between the level of popular support and the number of seats won in Parliament and the ability to form a government. What is truly shocking is that in Britain, no governing party has won a majority of votes since 1931. Every single government has won power based on minority support. Even Thatcher's landslide in 1983 and Blair's landslide in 1997 were based on about 42 or 43% of the vote. That is not democracy. And it breaks my heart that Labour seems content with this flawed and frankly corrupt electoral system, whereby millions of votes don't count and we keep on getting parties with minority support in power. If we'd had proportional representation, say in the 1970s, we would have never ever had the Thatcher government. Never had the Thatcher government or the Major government. So, to me, collaboration from the centre to the left is absolutely fundamental in powering forward a progressive government in this country. In addition, collaboration to keep out the Tories also means a progressive alliance of anti-Tory parties, where all those who oppose the Tories work together and collaborate with electoral deals to win at least key marginal constituencies. Now, as you recall, in the recent local elections in London, in the borough of Richmond, the Lib Dems and the Greens worked together on a progressive alliance. Labour refused, but the Lib Dems and Greens ousted the Tories. They would never ever would have done that if they hadn't worked together. So the Greens stood down for the Lib Dems stood down for the Greens, and they wiped the Tories out. It shows that a progressive alliance really can make a difference. Nationally, a progressive alliance similar to the one done in Richmond could probably oust between 30 and 60 Conservative MPs. That could make the difference between forming or not forming the next government. It could make the difference between a Conservative government and a non-Tory one. It is so depressing to hear Labour hostility towards the Lib Dems, the Greens, Plaid Cymru, and the SNP. This is, to be honest, it is sectarianism. Labour is a sectarian party. Now, there are many people in Labour who want to change, and I applaud and salute them. But the leadership is hell-bent on, we are the only progressive party, we don't care about the others. So, for example, you will know at the last general election, Labour organised to try and unseat the very left and progressive Green MP, Caroline Lucas. They wanted to get her out. In the local elections recently, Labour fought tooth and nail to oust Green councillors in Islington and in Camden. You know, there are differences between Labour and the Greens. The Greens are generally more progressive and more left, but we need to sink those differences to win. Number one priority is to get rid of the Conservatives. They are the roadblock to progressive change. And although there are differences between these other parties, there is also a lot of common ground. At the last general election in 2017, the Greens stood down in 30 seats to help Labour win. In 30 seats, the Greens stood down and helped Labour win key marginals. Labour did not reciprocate in even one seat. And they never even had the courtesy to thank the Greens for helping them win those seats. Among many Labour members, some seem to hate the Lib Dems in particular more than the Tories. I look at the social media messages from Labour supporters, and the bile against the Lib Dems is even worse than against the Tories. Now, I don't support the Lib Dems, but they are more progressive than the Tories, and there are some issues where historically they've been more progressive than Labour. They opposed the Iraq War. On environmental issues and equality issues, the Lib Dems have, in some cases, been ahead of Labour. So I just don't understand this intense oppositionist hatred. That's what it is. And I think we need to get rid of that. In addition, the left needs to accept constructive criticism without resorting to accusations of betrayal and traitorism. Some of you will know that Owen Jones, a Labour-supporting left commentator, made some constructive criticisms about the direction of Labour after Jeremy Corbyn's leadership success. He set out practical ideas how he felt that Labour could be stronger. This was not an attack upon Labour. He was, like me, trying to support Labour and put forward ideas to ensure that Jeremy Corbyn wins. But even his mild, constructive, comradely criticisms were denounced by many Labour supporters in really, really vicious terms. He was denounced as a Tory Trojan horse and many, many other things. Now, I'm not saying that all Labour people did that. I think it was only a minority. But it's shocking that it happened at all. Whether you agree with Owen Jones or not, he was coming from a good place with good intentions. And to be treated in that way is profoundly wrong. And it alienates so many people. When the public see the left treating the left in this way, they think, how can this party or this movement be fit for government? From my own personal point of view, many of you will know that I initially supported the legal prosecution or the legal action against Asher's Bakery in Northern Ireland over their refusal to bake a cake with a message, support gay marriage. But then somewhat later, I looked at the case in more detail and looked at the implications and decided, rightly or wrongly, that I don't believe that in a democratic society a business should be compelled to support a message that it has a fundamental conscientious objection to. It's a complex issue, but I tend to err on the side of freedom. Freedom of choice, freedom of expression, the freedom not to disseminate ideas with which one disagrees. Now, I had, from a section of the LGBT community, a huge wave of hostility that I had sold out the LGBT movement in Northern Ireland, that I was on the side of homophobes. And again, that is illustrative of the problem that some people cannot see a good intention. Even if I'm totally wrong, my intention was coming from a good place. And intention is always very important. Many of you will be familiar with the German left revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg. In contrast to Lenin and the Bolsheviks, she always argued that it's vital to defend internal party dissent and debate. That freedom to express your point of view, even one that dissents from the leadership, is a fundamental part of a democratic left movement. And she argued that without that internal debate, without the dissent, without the acceptance of that dissent, that a party would grow complacent, it wouldn't adapt and evolve, it wouldn't correct its mistakes, it wouldn't meet new challenges. In the end, what happens is arrogance and orthodoxy prevails. And that, to me, is the enemy of left-wing politics. Left-wing politics has to be open to constructive criticism, to debate, to dissent, to alternative ideas. And I think the left is often very weak on that. So, for example, I've never been, a great fan of the left's traditional opposition to the European Union. Not that I support the European Union, but I argued in favor of a unified pan-European left and trade union movement to challenge the power of corporate business. I argued that we need to link across borders to build a social Europe, a people's Europe. And when I was saying these ideas in the early 1980s, I got a ton of bricks on me from most people on the left who said I was colluding with this capitalist club. Well, quite clearly I wasn't. And even if people think I'm wrong, again, my intention was to build a European-wide, strong, powerful, progressive movement. Another point I think the left needs to rethink is to allow people to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Perhaps my view on the Ashes Bakery was a mistake. But we all make mistakes, and there's now a tendency for the approach to be one strike and you're out. You may have a long record, you may be a tireless fighter for social justice, but you make one mistake, one word out of place or one inappropriate word that you've used, and you'll get denounced and slaughtered and told you're not part of us. That is happening all the time. It's happening a lot, in particular, on social media. And I think it's really important for us to be forgiving, to recognize that people will make mistakes, and that if people recognize those mistakes and seek to put them right, we should be ready to forgive. We should want to embrace people, include people, not push them away. I think, there are many, many, many examples where, for example, people have been critical of Islamist extremism and then been denounced as being Islamophobic. Well, these people were not attacking the Muslim community, they were attacking the extremists who threaten above all others Muslim people themselves. But I can think of a whole raft of people, Mariam Namazi and so on, who have been fierce critics from a left and democratic point of view of Islamism, that is the political, theological movement of Islam, which wants to establish a religious dictatorship. They've been critical of that point of view, and they've been denounced as anti-Muslim and cast out as not part of the left. That is just so wrong. Many of you will be familiar with Majid Nawaz, who was a former Islamist extremist and himself, but then recognized that he was wrong and has now become a champion for a liberal progressive Islam and for challenging extremism in jihadism and other branches of Salafism and so on. Now, he is now widely denounced as an Islamophobe. The Southern SPLC, give me a... That's right, yeah, Southern Poverty Law Center, sorry. They have denounced him as an Islamophobe. I mean, this is really, really shocking. I've got great respect for the SPLC. They've done fantastic work. But to call Maajid Nawaz an Islamophobe is just so, so monstrous. You know, he absolutely defends Muslim people and Muslim communities, but he does target those who demand gender segregation in meetings like this. He does target those who justify wife-beating and other, misogynistic oppressions of women within Muslim communities. That is not Islamophobic. That's defending Muslim people who are victims of an extremist ideology. When I wrote a letter some years ago with about 200 other people to the Observer, criticizing the intimidatory and threatening atmosphere of the debate around trans issues, this letter in no way, in any way, criticized trans people, but simply said it's wrong to threaten or incite violence or try and shut down debate, that all voices should be heard. For that, I was denounced by some people in the trans movement as being transphobic. As I said, there was nothing in that letter that in any way condoned transphobia or even criticized trans people. It was simply defending free speech, including, implicitly, the free speech of trans people. And the argument we had was that the best way to deal with transphobia is not by blanket bans, but by having open debates where transphobes can be challenged, where their arguments can be countered, where evidence can be marshaled against them. And when I and others have done this, we've nearly always won the debate. Not that the issue was about winning the debate, but about in terms of winning hearts and minds. So again, I think we need to be really, really careful about this trend to demonize and exclude people on the left who take a different point of view and whose intentions are in the right place. Another point is that I think it's very incumbent on the left to have an agenda for social transformation, not just more public spending. I mean, you could say that Labour is largely stuck in the rut of what I'd call welfare statism. That's not unimportant at all. We must defend the welfare state. But surely a socialist agenda is about much more than simply providing a safety net for people. It's about more than public spending. And so far, even with Jeremy Corbyn's fantastic New Labour, or new Labour, the agenda doesn't really go beyond defending the welfare state, the NHS, and public services. The NHS doesn't just need more money. It needs to be fundamentally reorganized to give the staff and patients more power and to be more accountable to the staff and patients. The key issue, which the whole left pretty much, with very few exceptions, are dodging, is the issue of economic democracy. It is the single most important issue, in my opinion, of our age. But the left ignores it, or most of the left. So we all expect political democracy. Why not economic democracy as well? Let's look at Britain today. We are, to all intents and purposes, living in an economic dictatorship. The rich and powerful have all the votes, the rest of us have none. So in both private and public enterprises, it's the major shareholders, the managers, the directors, they have all the votes. the employees and the consumers have none. So I've argued, at a minimum, we ought to be urging or campaigning for economic democracy, whereby every private enterprise and every public institution, from the NHS to local councils, should have on its top management board at least 1/3 employee and consumer directors. Employee directors elected by the workforce, and consumers' representatives appointed by an independent, impartial body. That would give consumers and employees a direct input at the very highest level, where they can have access to full information about the corporation or about the public institution, where they can contribute to the debate, where they can vote, and where their vote will count equally with that of all the other directors. And if that existed, if that had existed, they would be able to blow the whistle on bad decisions. So, for example, if we'd had employee and consumer directors on the board of Northern Rock or RBS 20 years ago, they would have almost certainly had access to the corporate information which have highlighted the reckless, irresponsible decisions being taken. And they could have campaigned or voted or spoke against them in the board, and if the board ignored them, they could have gone public. And we might have been saved the 2008 economic crash. Another idea is that why should big corporations have control of employees' pension funds? Employees' pension funds are run by huge multinational corporations. I'd like to see them handed over to employee-owned mutual societies, where the employees had control over their own pension funds. And obviously they would get them administered by financial experts, but it would be under the direction of the employees. Why, for example, is it that when a company makes increases in productivity and profits, the employees don't get any bonuses? There's bonuses for the fat cats. Why not for the ordinary employees? Because the increase in productivity and profit would not come about without ordinary employees. So I say, give the employees bonuses, a share in the increased profits and productivity. Another issue which I think the left needs to address is that it needs to be politically and morally consistent. There is far too much hypocrisy and double standards. The left will always defend free speech and the right to protest for the left, but not for the right. And I don't really want to encourage or help the right in any way, but if you don't have a consistent position, then the public see through that. You're not credible. You don't have the moral high ground. There's a big debate going on about how should we respond to the rise of far-right populism. How should we respond to Islamism? I think there needs to be a very clear commitment that the principles of free speech, the right to protest, should apply across the board, unless, of course, people are inciting or encouraging violence. But on the international stage, there's also huge double standards. The left is very rightly critical of Saudi Arabia, and I've been part of the campaign for over 30 years against the Saudi state. But it's not so critical about what's going on in Iran, which is the other side of the coin. Both these countries are theocratic dictatorships which oppress and persecute their own people, which jail trade unionists, women's rights campaigners, LGBT people, which persecute ethnic and religious minorities. Why is the left's focus always on Saudi Arabia and not Iran? Now, there's a reason why we should give more emphasis to Saudi Arabia, because, of course, we buy their oil and we sell them weapons. So obviously there should be a bias towards critiquing Saudi Arabia and getting an end to those arms sales and I would say even probably breaking off diplomatic relations with the Saudis. But the absence of left-wing critique of the Iranian regime is so shocking. A few years ago, in one single night, 800 trade unionists were seized, arrested, and imprisoned by the Iranian regime. 800. Apart from a handful of people on the left, there was no public outcry. If even 3 trade unionists had been arrested and jailed in France or Germany, the whole left would have been in uproar. There'd be solidarity marches all over Britain. I could go on and on. The persecution of the Kurds, the Arabs, the Baluch, the Turkoman in Iran is racist neocolonialism of the worst kind. The execution of the famed Arab poet Hashim Shabani 3 or 4 years ago. Not a squeak from the left. One of the most revered poets in Iran, framed on trumped-up charges of terrorism because he supported Arab culture and the Arab people's right to self-determination. He was never involved in any violence whatsoever. Every Women's Day in Iran, International Women's Day in Iran, every 8th of March, brave women rally in so-called Justice Square, which should be renamed Injustice Square in Tehran, to demand women's rights. They are beaten and arrested, and the Western feminist movement and the Western left basically says and does nothing. The people can see through this. When the left is not consistent, when the left doesn't stand in solidarity with all peoples everywhere who are suffering injustice, people see inconsistency. And people don't like it. You know, take Yemen today. What the Saudis are doing in Yemen is horrendous. And I and others have rightly called it out. The whole left has been critical, and quite rightly. But what about what Iran is doing in Yemen? Iran is arming the Houthis, and the Houthis are committing mass human rights abuses. The left decries Saudi Arabia, not Iran. Why? Why the double standards? This is undermining the credibility of the left. When it comes to Israel, I'm a fierce critic of Israel and support the Palestinian cause. But by comparison to the neighboring states, the Arab states, you know, Israel actually has some good things about it. It is a democracy based upon displacement and annexation, but it is a democracy. That doesn't give Israel a free pass. I championed the idea of boycott, sanctions, and disinvestment back in the 1970s with Vanessa Redgrave. So I'm not at all giving Israel a free pass. But it infuriates me that the left does not critique the major dictatorships that surround Israel and their human rights abuses of their own people. The human rights abuses in those neighboring states are truly, truly shocking. But you'll be very hard-pressed to find a left-wing campaign or movement to critique them and to support the people in those countries who are striving for democracy and human rights. So this brings me to my next point, which is that the left needs to challenge all tyrannies, not just some. The left tends to go for those tyrannies that are anti the United States. So there are some on the left who are soft on Russia. Let's be frank. There is no great left-wing movement to support left-wing and trade union activists in Russia. When Russia jails trade unionists, do you hear any trade unions or left-wing people in Britain condemn or campaign for their release? I haven't. When the leader of the Red Front, some would say a far left but strongly socialist movement, gets jailed on trumped-up charges for 3 years, was there a single left-wing protest against that? No, not in Britain anyway. Syria. I don't want military intervention, but I ask myself, why isn't the left standing in solidarity with the non-violent democratic and left movement in Syria? Over 500,000 Syrians today belong to democratic left and civil society organizations who are against Assad, against the jihadists, against Russia, and against Iran. They get no support from the Western left. They've been written out of the narrative as if they don't exist. The narrative is it's Assad versus the terrorists. And the left and the right and the left play into that narrative. I find it unconscionable that a left movement which has a great history of internationalism will not give solidarity to those Syrians who share our values of democracy and human rights. That is a huge, monstrous betrayal. The left needs to revive that principle of solidarity with all oppressed people, not just those who are downtrodden by the West. Obviously, where the West is implicated, probably some greater priority should be given to that, because we can perhaps then influence things. But it doesn't mean we should look the other way and ignore the very real oppression that others may suffer. Going back to Iran, there are incredible heroic people in Iran. Ethnic minority activists, women's rights activists, LGBT campaigners, trade unionists, and many, many others who are risking their lives and liberty for a democratic Iran. They get no left support. And perhaps just to bring it home, in terms of internationalism in Europe, I'm constantly aghast that there is no serious collaboration between the British and the rest of the European left. Why aren't we working together to build alliances between all the left progressive parties across Europe and all the trade unions across Europe around a common agenda for a people's Europe, a social Europe, a socialist Europe? It seems that many people on the left in Britain still have this idea of we're somehow better or different from these other European socialists, that we can go it alone, that we can have socialism in one country. And one of the reasons why we lost the EU referendum was, of course, because there was no agenda about reforming the EU. If there'd been a critique of what's wrong with the European Union and how to fix it, I'm not saying that Remain would have won, but there certainly would be a greater possibility that Remain would have won. And I think that, again, this failure to link up with other European left progressive movements, and I say left, I mean left, the Greens, and others. If we all work together, we would collectively be much, much stronger. And likewise with the trade unions. There is some notional collaboration between the TUC and other European trade unions, but it's notional. We don't have a coordinated general strike across Europe, or go slow, or mass protests, very, very rarely anyway. And I think that has, that is both necessary to parallel or to counter the power of European capital, which is united. European capital they're all working together to maintain their power and their position. We need to parallel that, to shadow that, to mirror that with left and trade union coordination. So those are a few ideas. I may be entirely wrong, but that's what I believe. If we go down these roads, we are more likely to make the left successful. And I want the left to succeed. It hurts me to think that we're not as successful as we could be. Thank you.